said it would never happen, that Iran was too isolated, too sanctioned, too cornered to ever make a global move that shook the foundations of power. But then, the world watched in disbelief as Iranian bombers landed in Moscow, not in secret, but in full view, and the message was clear. The rules have changed. This isn't just another geopolitical twist. It's the ignition of something far greater, a quiet alliance that could rewrite the balance of power as we know it. In that single moment, the West felt the ground shift beneath its feet. This speech isn't just about military hardware or foreign policy. It's about a turning point in history. So don't blink, don't scroll, and don't walk away. Because if you think the world is still running on yesterday's logic, you're already behind. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why nothing will ever be the same again. When Iranian bombers touched down in Moscow, it wasn't just fuel, steel, and machinery that arrived. It was history-changing direction. The sight alone sent tremors through every intelligence agency, every Western capital, every so-called strategist who thought they had the map figured out. For decades, the world had painted Iran as the isolated villain, the rogue state boxed in by sanctions, threats, and propaganda. But now, those same forces watched Iran land military aircraft in the heart of Russia, not as a desperate partner, but as a calculated ally. This wasn't about trade. This wasn't about diplomacy. It was about alignment. A new kind of message written not in words, but in the shadow of bombers flying over foreign soil with permission, with purpose, and with intent. The move blindsided the West. They had watched Iran for years with a narrow lens, thinking it would stay confined to the sands of the Middle East, always reacting, never initiating. But this move wasn't reactionary. It was strategic, it was timed, and it told a bigger story than any press briefing ever could. Iran isn't staying quiet anymore. It isn't waiting for tables to be offered. It's building new ones in new places with new players. And when those players are nuclear powers like Russia, the equation changes fast. The stakes rise. The room gets colder. Because this isn't about two nations shaking hands. This is about two powers standing back to back, facing the same enemy, with no more fear in their eyes. What made the world uneasy wasn't the hardware Iran brought, but the confidence, the normalization of a relationship that had long existed under the radar, now out in the open, bold and unapologetic. It showed that Iran isn't just surviving sanctions, it's building partnerships in the very halls of those who challenge American dominance. The presence of Iranian bombers in Moscow said one thing louder than any headline. We're not alone anymore. And when nations that have endured isolation start finding each other, the balance of global power doesn't just shift, it trembles. That moment on the runway wasn't about war, but it was a form of warfare, psychological warfare, diplomatic warfare. A challenge to the Western idea that enemies can be controlled with enough pressure and punishment. Iran walked into Moscow not as a beggar, but as a signal. And the world heard it. The only question left now is whether they truly understand what comes next when the ones they feared most begin moving in formation. When the Kremlin speaks, it rarely shouts. It doesn't need to. Its power has always lived in silence, in suggestion, in the careful choice of words that say more between the lines than within them. And when Moscow responded to Iran's presence, not with rejection, but with strategic calm, it sent a message louder than missiles. The moment Russia hinted at nuclear support, it wasn't bluster, it was design, a veiled reminder to the West that Russia doesn't just play defense, and it doesn't stand alone. With Iran now seated at the edge of its military table, the stakes of any confrontation have just reached a place no side can afford to misread. No red button was pushed, no explicit vow was made, but the tone, the posture, the thinly veiled remarks about shared deterrence and new strategic understandings were enough to send policymakers scrambling. Because when a nuclear-armed superpower opens its doors to a nation like Iran, a nation long targeted, long underestimated, the balance of fear begins to shift. Suddenly, the West isn't looking at a scattered threat. It's looking at a potential axis, a coordinated front, backed by the threat of devastating retaliation. And in today's world, you don't need to launch to dominate. You just need to suggest. And Moscow knows that game better than anyone. The nuclear hint wasn't about immediate war. It was about global hesitation. It was about forcing Washington, London, Tel Aviv to pause before speaking, to rethink before acting. Because now Iran isn't just a target on a map. It's a potential partner to the only nation bold enough to challenge NATO on its doorstep. Russia didn't say it would arm Iran with nuclear capabilities, but it didn't say it wouldn't. And that silence alone created a storm. Markets trembled, diplomats panicked, and analysts rewound the tape of history, realizing this kind of alignment hasn't happened in decades. Iran's presence in Moscow isn't just symbolic, it's strategic leverage. The Kremlin's subtle nuclear undertones didn't need headlines, they just needed ears. Ears that have spent years listening to the myth that Western dominance is untouchable. That myth cracked the moment those bombers landed, and it fractured further when Moscow wrapped its arm around Tehran with a smile that didn't promise peace, but promised consequences. This is how Cold Wars ignite, not with declarations, but with calibrated gestures, with alliances built in plain sight that dare the world to guess their true weight. And in this case, the weight feels nuclear. Not because anyone pulled the trigger, but because someone placed their hand near it and looked the world in the eye. The West has always prided itself on having the upper hand, militarily, economically, diplomatically. Washington and NATO saw themselves as architects of order, the authors of international boundaries and balance. They believed they had Iran cornered, boxed in with sanctions, isolated with rhetoric, contained by threats of war and endless surveillance. Russia, too, was to be kept in check, weighed down by Ukraine, by economic warfare, by global conduct. But while the West stayed focused on its own strategy, a quieter story was unfolding, one they didn't see, or worse, refused to see. Iran and Russia weren't retreating, they were repositioning, not reacting to the game, but rewriting it. The landing of Iranian bombers in Moscow wasn't just unexpected, it was embarrassing. It revealed a massive intelligence and strategic oversight. Two nations long painted as threats to global peace had just found peace in each other. And the Western powers, so busy playing chess in their usual corridors, suddenly realized the board had expanded. They were no longer playing alone. There was now a new axis forming, one not defined by military alliances like NATO, but by a shared resistance to Western dominance and a willingness to act outside the rules the West wrote long ago. This caught NATO off guard. It wasn't just about two countries shaking hands. It was about two ideologies aligning, two nations that had withstood years of pressure, sanctions, and isolation, now proving that survival breeds resilience, and that resilience can evolve into coordinated strength. The West had underestimated Iran's reach, its technological advancements, its diplomatic discipline. They thought pressure would break Tehran. Instead, it taught it how to navigate towards stronger allies like Moscow, who also had been watching the West, not with fear, but with patience. The shock wasn't just military, it was psychological. The realization that for all its surveillance, all its diplomatic intelligence, the West never saw this alignment coming. And now that it has, the questions are bigger than how to respond. The real question is, can the West afford to respond without provoking a global crisis? Because unlike the past, where Iran could be bombed, sanctioned, or invaded without a second thought, today it has a seat at a much larger table, and Russia's at the head of it. This partnership challenges everything the West thought it controlled: airspace, narrative, leverage, deterrence. And it does so not with noise, but with precision, with silent moves that change the balance of fear. Iran's presence in Moscow revealed the blind spot in the Western strategy, and once that blind spot is exposed, the entire approach must be questioned. This is no longer a story of isolated threats. It's the rise of a new alliance that moves with quiet coordination and leaves behind a message the West didn't expect to read. We are not alone, and we are not afraid. This shift in global dynamics isn't happening where the West expected it. The old map of conflict centered around the Middle East: Gaza, Syria, Iraq, and more recently Ukraine. But now the front line is no longer limited to war-torn zones or proxy battlefields. It's stretching. They are beginning to ask new questions. What if unity came not through Western approval, but through mutual strength? What if sovereignty was reclaimed not by war, but by strategic cooperation? What if the Muslim world didn't need permission to rise? This alignment hints at a future where alliances are not based on fear or funding, but on shared resistance and unapologetic identity. It may not happen overnight, but the seeds are being planted. And every time an Iranian plane lands in Moscow, every time Kremlin officials speak about shared deterrence, those seeds grow a little deeper into the soil of Muslim consciousness. The West may not feel it yet, but the ground is shifting. And when Muslim nations begin to see strength in each other rather than threats, the world will face a different kind of power. One that doesn't beg for seats at global tables, but builds its own. One that watches this new axis form and quietly prepares to join, not as followers, but as partners in a different kind of future. What's happening between Iran and Russia isn't just a political maneuver. It's the beginning of a global realignment, the kind of shift that cracks the foundations of everything we thought was stable. For decades, the world operated under a clear hierarchy: Western alliances at the top, sanctioned states at the bottom, and everyone else caught somewhere in between. But when Iranian bombers landed in Moscow, and the Kremlin responded with strategic warmth, that old structure began to collapse in real time. It's not just about two nations teaming up. It's about a new world being born from the fractures of the old one, where power is no longer controlled by the usual suspects, and the lines between East and West, ally and enemy, friend and threat, begin to blur. This realignment is deeper than diplomacy. It's ideological, it's cultural. It's built not on treaties, but on shared experience, on the pain of being isolated, the strength found in resistance, and the vision of a future where Washington's influence doesn't reach every corner of the earth. Iran and Russia aren't just joining forces. They're building a narrative, one that says sovereignty is worth more than sanctions, and standing alone is better than kneeling with approval. This is a direct challenge to a system where the rules have always been written in English, enforced in dollars, and backed by military bases stretching across the globe. As this new alignment takes form, it forces other nations to reconsider where they stand. Countries once on the fence now see there's an alternative to Western-led globalism. Powers like China are watching closely. Regional players in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Africa are recalibrating their strategies. It's no longer about appeasing the United States or fearing NATO. It's about surviving in a world where unity among the once divided is finally possible. Iran and Russia are offering that possibility, not as saints or saviors, but as survivors, as nations that took the blows, held the line, and are now responding with precision rather than chaos. This realignment also changes how conflict is measured. It's no longer just missiles and troops, it's influence, economic alliances, energy corridors, technology transfers, and media control. It's building a network strong enough to withstand pressure and loud enough to counter the global narrative that has long painted resistance as rebellion and obedience as order. This is about rewriting what power looks like and who gets to define it. The moment Iran stepped into Moscow's sphere with its head held high, it lit a fuse beneath the global balance of power. The consequences won't be immediate, but they will be lasting. Because this is how the world changes, not with explosions, but with alignments, not with invasions, but with decisions made in quiet rooms by leaders who are done playing the roles history forced on them. This is the start of something bigger than a partnership. It's the birth of a new global rhythm, and the old world won't be able to dance to it. What began as whispers and back channels is now thundering across the global stage. Iran's strategic entry into Moscow wasn't just a headline, it was a declaration, a moment that shattered illusions and redrew the boundaries of influence, strength, and defiance. The West, long confident in its grip on global affairs, is now staring at an alliance it neither predicted nor prepared for. This isn't the revival of old empires. It's the emergence of a new order, one built not on compliance, but on resilience, not on permission, but on purpose. Together, Iran and Russia have issued a message that cannot be ignored. The age of Western monopoly on power is fading, and a multipolar world is no longer a theory. It's becoming a reality. And as this new reality unfolds, the silence of decades is being replaced by the sounds of strategy, unity, and unshakable resolve. History will remember this moment, not for the firepower, but for the fear it sparked in systems that thought they'd never be challenged. This is no longer about diplomacy alone. It's about survival, sovereignty, and the rewriting of the global playbook. Thank you for staying with me till the end. Your time is powerful, because in a world full of noise, choosing to hear the truth is a rare kind of courage. To the ones who see clarity in chaos, may you always see through the fog. To those rising from silence, may you walk with purpose and not fear. Good luck, stay strong, and remember, history favors the ones who speak when others stay silent. Thank you. Across a far more dangerous and strategic landscape, the heart of Eurasia, the arrival of Iranian bombers in Moscow doesn't just mark an alliance, it marks the geographic repositioning of confrontation. Two of the world's most sanctioned, scrutinized, and underestimated powers are drawing a new border not with ink, but with movement, with presence, with steel wings in Russian skies and political silence louder than thunder. This new front line is sophisticated. It's not one you can bomb and walk away from. It's not a jungle or a desert. It's a heavily armed corridor from Tehran to Moscow, threaded with technological cooperation, intelligence sharing, and deep military calibration. What makes it so dangerous is not just its firepower, but its unpredictability. Unlike NATO's visible and bureaucratic moves, this axis operates in layers, what you see is only the surface. Beneath it lies coordination that runs on patience, shared scars, and an unspoken code of mutual survival. This isn't just the Middle East heating up. It's Eurasia, bracing for a seismic realignment. What's even more critical is how this emerging front redefines the nature of global tension. This is no longer about occupying land. It's about weaponizing relationships. Iran and Russia are building a front that isn't just fortified with missiles, but with strategy and defiance. When bombers landed in Moscow, it wasn't to fight a war today. It was to show the world where the next one might begin. A war, not for territory, but for influence. For who gets to decide what global power looks like when the old empires fade? And the West, still locked in Cold War reflexes, isn't ready for this kind of battle. This is hybrid warfare before the bullets fly. Psychological, diplomatic, symbolic. A new chessboard has been set up right in the middle of Europe and Asia, and the pieces are being placed without a single treaty being signed. Iran's arrival in Moscow was the opening move. The Kremlin's quiet nuclear hint was the second. And what follows now could define a generation. This front line didn't come with a declaration. It comes with quiet gestures that change global calculations. And those calculations are no longer predictable. Because if Iran, once a regional pariah, can now stand alongside a nuclear giant inside its capital, then what stops others from joining? What prevents this new coalition from reaching further, pushing harder, and redrawing boundaries that the West once believed were permanent? This is not just the rise of a new power bloc. It's the expansion of the battlefield into territory the West never thought it would have to defend, not with troops, but with strategy, restraint, and the kind of wisdom that must come quickly, or not at all. As Iran positions itself beside Russia on the global stage, something far greater is unfolding across the Muslim world. It's not loud, it's not announced in breaking news headlines, but it's there, rising in the minds of millions who have watched for decades as their nations were pressured, divided, and dismissed. The old order treated Muslim countries as pawns, either too weak to resist or too disunited to matter. But this new moment, this alliance between Tehran and Moscow, isn't just about Iran or Russia. It's about signaling to every Muslim majority nation that the center of power is shifting, that there is an alternative to submission, that the world no longer revolves around Washington, London, or Brussels. This quiet awakening isn't fueled by hate. It's driven by exhaustion. Exhaustion from watching Gaza burn while international bodies debated resolutions that never meant anything. Exhaustion from seeing Western allies turn their backs the moment oil deals or arms sales took priority over human lives. Exhaustion from being lectured about democracy and justice while being denied both in global policy. So now, when Iran steps into Moscow with strength, not supplication, it isn't just representing its own sovereignty. It becomes a symbol of defiance for the entire Muslim world. For years, many Muslim nations walked a tightrope, caught between economic dependency on the West and cultural loyalty to their people. But this growing alignment is showing that real power comes not from imitation, but from independence. When a sanctioned nation like Iran moves with purpose and finds partnership at the nuclear table, it sends a message. Being outside the Western circle doesn't mean being powerless. In fact, it might be the only way to stay unbroken. That message is resonating, not because everyone agrees with Iran's policies or trusts Russia's intentions, but because people are tired of watching their nations bow to systems that never protected them.